Welcome everybody, good afternoon. This is the second in two panels on what happens next. This one focusing on foreign policy and international affairs. Of course, we are assuming, at least for now in this panel, that by January, we will have a president-elect Biden. And we're not assuming anything about the Senate, although I want to come back to that question a little bit later. But here's the format. So we're going to ask our panelists to do very short answers to an introductory question. Then we'll open it up for your questions. And then we'll do a second round of questions to the panelists. So that's the idea. We're hoping to make this a very interactive conversation as much as anything else. So let me start by introducing the panelists. We have Professor Karen Musallo, Professor David Takash, Professor Joel Paul, and Professor Shaman Keitner. All of UC Hastings and all experts in various aspects of international law and foreign affairs. And so I wanted to start by asking you a very general question. So what is the one thing that the Biden administration will do that is most important and that will be different from what we have now? And let me start with Professor Musallo.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Roth Ariaza. I am going to use a really short PowerPoint, and I'm going to sort of, Naomi said the one thing. Well, before I show my PowerPoint, I just want to say that as of July, the Trump administration had taken 400 executive orders affecting immigration. So you will excuse me if I, in my presentation, kind of touch on 4 or 5 rather than
one.
It's actually hard to pick the 4 or 5 given the 400 as of July. So if the technology gods are with me, I will show my screen and then I will go very quickly and keep to my 5-minute allotted time. Okay. There we go. Okay. So really, this is entitled Rebuilding the U.S. System of Protection, because this has been a total destruction of our system of protection. And you might ask, why is immigration law under this rubric of sort of international and foreign policy? It's because immigration law and refugee protection really is part of our international obligations, the convention and the protocol, and a commitment to protect those fleeing persecution. And there's 2 ways in which the US does that. It admits refugees from abroad through the US Refugee Admissions Program, and it allows people to show up at its border or from within the country to ask for protection. So these are commitments the US made through international treaty and through enactment of domestic law. So the Trump administration has really eviscerated, destroyed both of these routes to protection. So just in terms of, admitting refugees from abroad, if you remember the very first week of the Trump administration and a rollout of all these executive orders, which attempted to suspend refugee admissions and then to ban refugees from certain countries. There's a lot of litigation. Ultimately, what the Trump administration settled on was just reducing the number of refugees admitted so that it was so small in terms of the need that it was like killing the program. So it went from, Obama outgoing number of admitted refugees, 110,000, down to 15,000 this year. So what would a Biden administration do differently? Well, already the administration's made a commitment to increase refugee admissions to 125,000. Then in terms of what it's done at the border, it's really ended what we know as asylum at the border by putting in place procedural barriers that prevent arrival of asylum seekers, punitive measures to deter their arrival, changes to the refugee definition, which are intended to deny protection, and all of this without any congressional enactment, really all executive orders, agency directives, and regulations. So among these, I'm going to pick the 4 or 5 that were most deathly, that really put an end to protection. family separation, which is fairly notorious at this point, with an idea that if you basically took children away from their parents, you would deter their arrival. Word would get out and people wouldn't come. So that policy was challenged. There was public outcry. This was one of the few things that the Trump administration backed off of and supposedly ended family separation, but the practice continues to this day. 5,400 families separated, parents, of at least 545 cannot be found. And what the Biden administration, what it would do differently, it's at this point committed to form a task force to find and reunite families, and obviously to not continue separating families. Migrant protection protocols, and I promise I just have one or two more policies. This one was pretty draconian. Before the Trump administration, any asylum seeker who showed up at our border could enter and remain in the US while he or she pursued their case. This migrant protection protocols forced them to remain in Mexico, in dangerous border towns, lacking representation, no safe place to stay. Really, in a way, was such a departure from our former policies. Lots of violence against these asylum seekers who are stuck in Mexico. I think I made a mistake in this slide, apologies. But there's been multiple legal challenges, and the Biden administration is committed to ending Remain in Mexico. Last two, this is sort of the outsourcing of refugee obligations. The US signed agreements with countries that are really the main producers of asylum seekers because their human rights situation is so bad. But the US sort of outsourced its refugee obligations to those countries, entering into agreements that allows the US to send asylum seekers to those three countries, for those three countries to have the responsibility to protect them and to adjudicate their claims. And the Biden administration committed to rescind that. And then the closing the border entirely. So this was in March, where under the pretext of public health measure, the border was totally closed to asylum seekers, allowing immediate expulsion. And I just want to note about this that the Centers for Disease Control were opposed to this and were really pressured by the White House to go along with it. So now the border is totally closed down and no asylum seekers are admitted. And then lots of attorney general decisions to limit the refugee definition. And then sort of my last slide here, because I know my 5 minutes is basically up. Talked a lot about refugee and asylum issues. There's so many other immigration issues we could talk about, but just to highlight a couple of things that the Biden incoming administration has committed to: restoring deferred action for childhood arrivals or protection for the Dreamers, rescinding the Muslim ban, rescinding temporary suspension of immigrant visas, putting a 100-day freeze on deportations to reconsider who really should be deported. There's a lot of people here in unlawful status, but not all of them should be a high priority for deportation. And then I think in the foreign policy realm, really signaling a desire to work with the refugee sending countries to address root causes. So having a constructive rather than a punitive foreign policy assistance. So there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to a completely different subject. Be writing down your questions, put them in the chat, and I will come back and call on people. David. Unmute.
5 minutes. What's that?
Oh, okay, it's good.
So in 1992, concerned about the existential threat that climate change poses to human civilization, all of the nations of the world got together and ratified the UN Convention on Climate Change. 5 years later, that was operationalized in the Kyoto Protocol. All of the nations of the world committed to coordinated action, except for Andorra, Afghanistan, and the United States. The United States Senate voted 95-0 not to ratify any treaty that would either harm the US economy or require emissions reductions of developed countries and not developing countries. The rest of the world, the developed world, committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 5% below 1990 levels by 2012. The United States, again, did not join the Kyoto Protocol. In 2012, that treaty expired without a follow-up. In 2015, nations of the world got together and agreed to the Paris Agreement. It's called an agreement and not a treaty because it is informal and requires no formal ratification by the US Senate or any other deliberative body. The goal of the Paris Agreement is to try to limit global temperature increases to about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels, which all scientists agree is actually catastrophic in and of itself, but it's less catastrophic than it otherwise would be. The commitments under the Paris Agreement are voluntary. All nations have come forth with nationally determined contributions, what they voluntarily are going to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. President Obama did come forth and say that the United States plans to cut our emissions to 26% below 2005 levels by 2025. That is not a particularly ambitious emissions reduction. If all nations of the world had committed to the same level of reductions, the global temperature would go up about 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Last week, the day after the election, President Trump withdrew us formally from the Paris Agreement. There's 5 points I'd like to make. The planet, especially the most vulnerable human and non-human communities, can only benefit from any greenhouse gas emission reductions that anyone takes. So any commitment that the Biden administration makes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will be of great help. The United States is the leading emitter of greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution, currently with the second leading emitter after China. Second, it's often said that this is a chance for the United States to reassert our global leadership on climate. I'm a bit less sold on that, having balked at both the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The world is not exactly waiting for our leadership. In fact, the European Union and China have rushed in to fill the vacuum on climate leadership. It was feared that once the United States pulled out, other nations would also pull out or reduce their commitment. Instead, no one has pulled out, and in fact, even in the last couple of weeks, China, Japan, South Korea have dramatically increased their voluntary commitments under the Paris Agreement. Third, under the Paris Agreement, developed world is committed to spending $100 billion a year or more to help developing nations adapt to climate change or to lead a pathway to a low carbon future. By a Biden administration would presumably be contributing to that fund, which we have withdrawn from. The most important point I want to make about climate change is that although this is about international relations and foreign affairs, really my talk belonged on Tuesday's talk because climate change is fundamentally a domestic issue. By taking action on climate change, it's really about the air that we breathe in the United States. It's about what happens in your public lands. It's about how you transport yourself from place to place on a daily basis. It's about what kind of taxes you pay and for what. It's about how the food you eat gets grown. It's about who gets employed or unemployed in what kinds of industries. And so we'll be looking in the coming years at federal legislation, which is questionable if it's going to happen. It's about actions that happen in the executive branch under the EPA and other branches. And it's about what happens at the state and local and individual level, because many jurisdictions are still committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. In the remaining minute, I want to say 2 other things. When we talk about international environmental law and foreign affairs, climate change tends to suck all the air out of the room. We pay less attention to the twinned crisis of biodiversity destruction and the undercutting of ecosystem function, which also threatens human civilization. The United States is the only nation never to ratify the Convention on Biological Diversity. Presumably, a Biden administration will be increasing our efforts to contribute to global efforts to reduce biodiversity destruction. Last thing I want to say is the United States has also never ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Currently, there is a deep sea convention being negotiated that aims to protect the over half of the ocean that has no formal protection. Presumably, the United States will be playing a greater role in that, as well as participating in negotiations about what happens in the Arctic after the sea ice has melted, as because we are not part of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, our ability to participate in that effort has also been undercut, and presumably a Biden administration will play a greater role there as well. Happy to answer any questions in the chat afterwards.
Great, thank you. Okay, turning from the environment to trade and investment, Joel.
Thanks, Naomi. Trump came into office with an idea that was essentially a very old idea, an idea about mercantilism. That is, that the real problem with our trade policy was our trade deficit. What we really needed to do was to eliminate a trade deficit. Now, those of you who understand something about economics know that a trade deficit is neither good nor bad. It depends on the circumstances. So what Mr. Trump set out to do was to basically wreak havoc with our trade relations. And he did this by imposing about $80 billion worth of tariffs on goods coming from from the European Union, from Mexico, from Canada, from Japan, China, and Korea, and tearing up the trade agreements that had been negotiated heretofore, not only the NAFTA agreement, but abandoning the talks that we were engaged in at the time to form the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact. As a result of this, Mr. Trump did not get what he wanted. He got the opposite. Our trade deficit has soared. It has soared because of retaliatory measures taken against the United States due to our trade sanctions that were, by the way, illegal under the World Trade Organization. And in addition, it has soared because of the problems that it creates for US export industries. US export industries were oftentimes dependent on those very imports that were now subject to tariffs. In fact, the amount of tariffs that were imposed were equivalent to between $1,500 and $3,600 per family in the United States, which constituted the largest single tax increase in the history of the United States. Mr. Trump's trade problems were also a consequence of his failures to do other things. His failure to fund infrastructure, which had a negative impact on our productivity, and the barriers he created in immigration, because really we depend on immigration to build our economy, to create more jobs and to create more goods and services. So in the absence of immigration, in the absence of investments in infrastructure, Mr. Trump instead decided to impose tax cuts. And those tax cuts also had an adverse impact on his economic policies because they tended to strengthen the dollar and make US exports less attractive to the rest of the world. So what is it that Mr. Biden is proposing to do to build back better, as he likes to say? Biden's policies are premised on what he calls a Made in America tax policy. The tax policy would be designed in such a way as to create a surtax on employers who move jobs overseas. Anyone who offshores jobs would be subject to a 10% surtax on their corporate tax. In addition, he would eliminate certain deductions that corporations now enjoy when they do move jobs overseas. And he would strengthen Buy America rules, which essentially mean that US government offices and state and local offices would be required to purchase goods made in America first, rather than goods manufactured overseas. He also proposes to strengthen our anti-inversion rules. The anti-inversion rules, which were introduced in the 2018 tax bill, basically discourage US corporations from turning into foreign corporations for tax purposes in order to avoid US taxes. And perhaps most significantly, his investments in infrastructure, particularly in sustainable clean technologies, would have a dramatic impact on our trade. because those countries which develop expertise in clean technologies are most likely to be the leaders in trade in the coming future. They're the ones who are going to have a more expanding market. And so abandoning the shift from fossil fuels to cleaner technology should be a significant boost to our export trade as well. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Mr. Trump's abandonment of our trade relationships, and particularly his abandonment to the World Trade Organization, have really undermined the confidence of our trading partners. And Biden must begin to rebuild those relationships. However, the problem that Biden faces is a political problem, which is that a significant portion of the Democratic Party has traditionally been averse to free trade agreements because of the failure of those agreements to deal adequately with the problems of both environmental pollution and labor. So what Biden has to do is to find a way to create enforceable labor and environmental standards and incorporate those into the World Trade Organization and into any future free trade agreements that he may want to negotiate. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Boy, a lot to chew on there. I hope people are thinking of really good questions. Finally, Professor Keitner.
Yes, definitely a lot that we've covered in a very short time. And so maybe I can take a step back in my 5 minutes. And I hear David's point that some of the issues we're talking about also, of course, very much implicate domestic law, because really all of our actions are governed by various layers of law, whether it's international, federal, state, even municipal, and international law is just one more layer. So when we think about sort of where we are and where we're headed, which is how I took the question, so a little bit more broadly, I guess I have 3 major observations to share that will hopefully generate some discussion. The first I've been thinking about is, are there changes in how the United States sees the world? What are the changes in how the world sees the United States? And what are our major challenges right now? And of course, we've got many of them, but we need to prioritize. So how the United States sees the rest of the world, I think, has changed. And although I think it's absolutely fair to say that right now we do have a President-elect Biden, and on January 20th, we will have a President Biden, we also have more than 70 million Americans who voted for a second term for President Trump. And we may well have a Republican Senate. And I think that the message we need to take from that is that a great percentage of Americans don't feel like the bargains we've struck abroad or the bargains we've struck at home have served them. And so we don't anticipate, and the Biden team certainly has not conveyed, a return to the real heavy overseas extension and involvement of post-World War II America. We're going to see a lot more inward-facing focus, precisely because I think there's a sense shared on both sides of the aisle that an excessive focus and devotion of resources outwards at the expense of sufficient focus inwards means that the United States has not, in fact, been able to support and promote whether it's ideals of democracy, free trade, fairer standards for workers, free flow of goods and people. So there's going to have to be a fundamental renegotiation in a way, both of our own social contract and of our relationship to the rest of the world. I also think we're seeing, partly because of technology and partly because of the real demand, for example, to bring troops home, much more willingness to engage on the cyber front, right? We already saw this under the Obama administration, a lot more drone warfare, which is different from cyber, but again, unmanned vehicles for the most part, rather than engaging with boots on the ground. And so we're going to see projection of force, but not through human means. And so we're going to see a different orientation to the rest of the world that I think in some respects may not be such a bad thing, but that we're going to need to think about and to come to terms with. And certainly the executive branch will set the tone for that. But Congress also plays a central role in foreign policy, as you heard from David Dakash. Obviously, under domestic law, only the Senate can give its advice and consent to a treaty. So although the Paris Climate Agreement under international law very much is a binding agreement, under US domestic law, we can't call it a treaty without triggering that requirement of Senate consent and sort of the whole other conversation to have about, again, getting the Senate on board with whatever foreign policy goals the Biden administration wants to promote. So how the US sees the rest of the world, certainly not in the sort of hostile posture that I think the Trump administration has seen it, but not with the same degree, I think, of eagerness to engage that we've seen in prior both Republican and Democratic administrations. Number two, how the world sees the United States. Again, we're going to need to tread softly. I don't think our traditional allies are going to, they're certainly welcoming us back with open arms. We've certainly had a lot of congratulatory calls to President-elect Biden, but they're going to welcome us back with a certain degree of understandable wariness. And wariness because we have shown that every 4 years, they have reason to expect a radical change in the US posture towards our alliances and our commitments to multilateral institutions. And so I think we're going to have to reckon with that wariness and understand that it's going to take generations, really, to rebuild trust in the United States as a reliable international partner. And then finally, I think my biggest concern and a real focus of the Biden administration, as you heard from President-elect Biden's first public speech a couple of days ago, will be trying to heal internal divisions, of which there are many. In 2016, the Russians very effectively exploited and exacerbated those divisions. And since that time, the Republican Party has really taken up that mantle and very successfully continued to divide Americans from each other. And I think we here in California, in the Bay Area, also have to reckon with the fact that US social media companies have really provided the tools with which to do that extremely effectively. And unless we address the real problems with our disinformation environment, I think we are going to have a harder time bringing Americans together, which we need to do in the long term, not only for our own sake, but for the sake of the good that the United States has historically done and could continue to do in the world in the right circumstances.
Great, thank you. So I wasn't going to put myself in here, but I am going to put myself in for just about a minute. And then we'll turn to questions. So I had 3 things that I wanted to say from my perspective. One is, I think one of the changes will be from a sort of transactional view of what is in our national interest to something more that has some value content to it. So I think that the support that we've seen up till now, for instance, for authoritarian governments, will change. I'm not sure to what extent it will change, but it will change. Second, multilateralism. So, Biden has said he will put us back into the WHO, that he will re-engage with international institutions like the UN. But here's the problem. Those institutions are weak with or without the US. And they are in danger of becoming more and more deadlocked less agile, less able to respond to the challenges that they need to be able to respond to, and simply putting the US back into the mix, while it is surely a move in the right direction, may not be enough. And then the third thing, support for civil society. So there has been a closing of space for civil society around the world in the last 4 years. Whether or not, you trace this entirely to Trump doesn't matter. But there is a need for a concerted effort on the part of the Biden administration. And I think given his prior work, for instance, in Latin America, there will be greater support for civil society groups working on things like anti-corruption, human rights, protection of land, protection of indigenous peoples. It remains to be seen how much, but it will clearly be something. Okay, let me open it up. So I have Mario Lopez. You want to start us off?
Yes, thank you very much for all of you for having this great panel. I have two questions. The first one is regarding international agencies. NATO, for example. NATO has been a huge success by many points, and the fact that Europe has not gone to war with each other on a grand scale, and that has meant that the United States has not had to step in. However, we saw during President Trump's administration that he threatened NATO openly, and there really wasn't much pushback by the American people. Do you see the Biden administration being able to sell the value of NATO and other international organizations to Americans, and showing that our commitment to our allies abroad has a direct impact on our day-to-day life here? And second, as it pertains to Latin America, it seems in many ways that Latin America has been forgotten from various administrations. Do we see a change in that? Specifically, does the Biden administration take a different position on Venezuela compared to past administrations?
I can take the Latin American piece if somebody else could take the NATO piece. So yes, so the Trump administration had a very single-minded focus on Latin America, and it was only and exclusively about migration and stopping the movement of people into the US, and secondarily continuing what is more and more recognized as a failed war on drugs. And that was the extent of it. One thing to remember about Biden is that he was for quite some time the point person on Latin America under Obama, and even before that. And so has some knowledge of the region, which I think will stand him in good stead. For instance, he was the person who was pushing support for the Anti-Impunity Commission in Guatemala. So I think you'll see a different tone. On Venezuela, I think you'll see a much more collaborative policy with other countries, both in Europe and in Latin America. An attempt to try to not simply slam the existing government with sanctions, which has turned out to be counterproductive and has ended up hurting, as sanctions often do, the Venezuelan people as much as anything else, while insulating the government, which is perfectly happy to live off the black market. So I think there will be much more of a multifaceted and collaborative approach, especially to places like Venezuela, and also a slightly less single-minded focus on Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, to the exclusion of places like Honduras, where the conditions for the population are as bad, if not worse. On NATO, I'll leave it to somebody else.
I'm happy to chime in. So I think that the line on NATO, Mario, as you pointed out, has been we've been taken advantage of because we pay more than our fair share, and I do think other countries have increased their contributions, but there certainly may have been much more constructive ways to get them to do that. The two issues, I think, with regard to Europe are, number one, that the European Union has really been the framework within which Europe has both flourished economically and also, as you mentioned, avoided going to war internally, at least state to state. And Brexit, I think, is really the biggest rupture that we've seen, which was absolutely not, not a U.S. related phenomenon, although very much a parallel phenomenon where we witnessed again Russian interference and disinformation alongside the rise of a populist authoritarian leader, right? So we need to really keep an eye on that, and it will be interesting to see how the Biden administration deals with a UK that's taken that final step towards Brexit, while at the same time maintaining our relationships with the rest of Europe. I think NATO got too big, right? And the problem was too much was expected of it. And this is one of the reasons, not an excuse by any stretch, but one of the provocations for Putin many years ago invading Crimea, this notion that NATO was getting somehow expansionist and not actually being a defensive organization. And so I think, that even though the focus has been so much in these last couple of years on Iran and North Korea in terms of nuclear capabilities, the much bigger relationships that we're going to have to navigate in terms of threats to the United States, to US interests, and to those of our allies are obviously the continued rivalry with Russia and the US-China relationship, which of course our colleague Keith Hand is the expert on and has spoken on in a number of at a number of different fora. So I think we need to support the European Union. We need to figure out how to get the UK to play nicely with its neighbors, but also realize that that we don't necessarily need to be the babysitter in all of these relationships and shouldn't take it upon ourselves to be. And I think the biggest issues we're going to have to figure out are the rise of Russia and China in another sort of great power rivalry context that we haven't seen for some time.
Thank you. So I have a question, and I'm just going to open this up. Do you foresee a Biden administration withdrawing from Middle Eastern involvement, including Afghanistan, and as it relates to Syria, Yemen, and countering Iranian activity? So that's probably 3 questions in one, but I'll throw it open, see who wants to take it.
So I think we will see reduced support for Saudi Arabia and Yemen, absolutely. Although, as Naomi wisely said earlier, a values-based foreign policy is going to encounter some practical limits, and we'll have to see what those are. As you recall, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis resigned because the president was so abrupt and erratic in his decisions about withdrawal from Syria. But I do think we will see continued movement in that direction, quite simply because the American public no longer has an appetite for it. What I hope and expect is that we will do so in a much more measured, strategically well-informed fashion in coordination with our allies on the ground rather than abandoning them.
Anyone else? Anyone else want to take on how about the Iranian piece? Are we going back into some kind of deal with Iran? Is that, or is that a dead deal no matter what, and there's not much anybody's going to do to revive it?
All right, so I'm waiting for my colleagues to unmute in the meantime. There's no JCPOA anymore, right? And if you look at Iranian stockpiles of enriched uranium, they're much bigger than they were when Obama left office, and predictably so. So, our sanctions policy has been a complete disaster. Not only that, but the New York Times recently reported that President Trump and Attorney General Barr were heavily pressuring the Southern District of New York to drop its criminal prosecution of the Turkish bank that was circumventing US sanctions on Iran and funneling hundreds of millions of dollars to the Iranian regime. So we will restore sanity, but we're not going to get the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action back. As you may recall, European countries attempted to stay in some sort of arrangement with Iran and continue to use some sort of economic leverage and carrots to get the regime to scale back in its nuclear ambitions. And some sort of reconstituted arrangement might be possible. Certainly the secondary sanctions that the US has been slapping on other countries have further frayed our relations with them. But again, it comes back to, can we be credible and reliable when we've shown that in 4 years' time, all bets may be off the table? And so I hope that some others on the call have a more optimistic view of our ability to restore faith in the US keeping our word. That's where I just feel like the Trump administration and the Trump presidency has really put us at a long-term disadvantage.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here. Let's see. Joel, did you want to say something about where we are now?
Well, I just want to give the devil's advocate argument here in answer to Shemin. I do have a little bit more confidence than she does that we will come to see the 4 years of the Trump administration as an interregnum, as just such a uniquely disastrous abandonment of everything that our country has stood for since the Second World War. And that moving forward, I think that our allies will see us going back to status quo ante. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than Shemin is about the way in which this will be perceived.
Great. So we have a question. Let's see. I want to see if I can move on to a couple of these other questions. We have a question from a student that's not in the chat, but I'm going to take it anyway. Teray, do you want to ask your question? Can you do that?
I was trying to type it. I'm sorry.
Just ask. It's okay.
Okay. Well, Trump's like anti-abortion limits on like foreign aid was like very drastic to like public health projects around the world. And although like President-elect Biden said he will reverse it, and I don't know, because when I was watching the elections, it just still seems kind of like scary that Trump got so many votes. And so like, how does President-elect Biden repair that image around the world?
I mean,
I want to take that.
Yeah, maybe just sort of wading into this as somebody who's a very impassioned observer of what's going on. I mean, I think that it's by what actions the administration takes, and whether it, whether kind of what Professor Paul said, will the world come to see these 4 years as an aberration and an affirmation of the image they had of the US, whether it's true or false? We could discuss the reality of the US. We could invoke Howard Zinn's, the people's history of the US, and are we really as good as our image? But I think the main point is, what will we see out of this administration? And will we see the commitments that Biden made? Will we see him, move forward? And I want to make a plug for, civil society and we, everyone who feels that certain issues are important. We need to be advocates for that and support the good inclinations of this administration, and push the administration to be true to its promises and be true to the ideals. So we have a role in this also.
So I've got a couple of questions here that go further along those lines. What are the ramifications of the international community's wariness of the US democratic process? And now specifically around the failure to concede the election and how that is seen in the rest of the world in terms of the democratizing world, what does it say about the strength of American democratic institutions and democracy generally? Or is it too early to tell? And I wanted to take at least a little bit of a crack at that. And I think one of the things that has changed fundamentally, at least in some of the work that I've done, the US has always held itself out as the paragon of virtue when it comes to rule of law, right? We teach other people how to do rule of law. We spend lots of money teaching other people how to do rule of law. We hold up our Constitution as the democratic Constitution par excellence and what everybody else should aspire to. And I think that has been fundamentally blown out of the water by the last 4 years. I think that it is very hard for us to now go to some other country and say, do it the way we do it. Maybe not. And so other constitutional models that have more explicit attention, for example, to inequality and economic and social rights, constitutions that have more ability to check the government, not just from the executive and judicial branch, but from some kind of ombudsman type function, role of a constitutional court, a whole bunch of variations on how constitutions are organized, I think are on the table in a way that they weren't 4 years ago, because it's become painfully clear the limits of the US, both constitutional and political system, to adequately provide for rule of law. So that would be one answer to this. I don't know if people have another.
I guess I'm the optimist here.
Amazing.
Playing against type here.
Yes.
I'm going to be the optimist. In this respect, Naomi, I do think that the rest of the world has a vested interest in seeing the United States in a certain role. I mean, the fact that they see us as a world leader for democracy and the rule of law and human rights, in some sense, takes some of the burden off of them. And they, the Europeans in particular, and I'm thinking mostly of the Europeans here, the Europeans and the Japanese think of us as their protector, and they want to think of us as their protector. It suits their purposes to think of us that way. And so I think that they will have a natural inclination to want to believe that Biden is a return to the normalcy of the Obama administration. And of course, he's going to have to wrestle with a Republican Party that may or may not still be the Republican Party, or maybe it's now the Trump Party. We don't know what the Republican Party is going to be, but he still has the majority. And even if he doesn't have the majority in the Senate, he will have the majority in the House. And I think that in general, presidents can do more in the field of foreign affairs than they can in domestic policy. So that I think that he will have the opportunity to act in a way that is consistent with the expectations and the desires of what our trade partners and allies want the United States to be.
Maybe just two little points to add on to that. Number one, I think, Joel, you're absolutely right. And I was just listening this morning to a program that talked about how Germany in particular, right, does have this view of the United States, whereas France, at least according to this one French commentator, has been looking with a little bit more pity at the United States for precisely the reasons that Naomi mentioned, right? That we don't have a robust social safety net and healthcare system for all Americans, that we do have dramatic social inequality that is, getting worse and worse. And so, so some of these other models might look more appealing, right, or humane, depending on one's perspective. The little data point about the return to normalcy was, even though the State Department at the moment is not actually opening its doors to the Biden transition team or even apparently transmitting messages of congratulations received from foreign leaders to the president-elect. Nonetheless, President-elect Biden has had, as many have noted, calls with some foreign leaders arranged himself or for him, and has provided readouts of those calls. In other words, detailed summaries of what was discussed to the public. And journalists are rejoicing because they haven't seen a readout of a call in 4 years. And so some of these old habits have not yet fully died, and there will be certainly a restoration in terms of process anyway, which could go a way towards restoring faith. I agree.
Okay, we have a question on the World Trade Organization. I heard the World Trade Organization has harmed some smaller local businesses by shutting them down to promote international trade. Obviously, this harms local economies, and also the environment would greatly benefit from a reduction in the amount of goods shipped across the globe. Do we have any, as the US, any ability to promote the concept of local business globally while rejoining, although I'm not sure we ever left the WTO? Can we demand more equitable and eco-friendly practices from the WTO? And how do these things balance each other? And I think, Joel, that's probably your bailiwick.
Right. So without getting too deeply into this, the problem that the president-elect faces is that a large part of the Democratic Party is very averse to international trade agreements. But their aversion to international trade agreements and the concerns that are raised by the question has to do with the concerns about labor and the environment. And so what we have to do is we have to find mechanisms that are enforceable mechanism for protecting labor and environmental interests. Up to this point in time, all of our free trade agreements, including the World Trade Organization, have provisions that deal with labor and the environment, but they all have proven to be paper tigers. They have no teeth. They do not protect those interests effectively. There are ways to protect those interests effectively. As Naomi knows, I have been a longtime advocate for anti-dumping duties used to prevent imports that are socially dumped, that are produced by workers that are not being paid fair wages, or that are produced in ways that are not sustainable. And I think something like that is going to have to be developed in order to get a consensus in Congress for supporting those agreements, and also to get a consensus in the World Trade Organization. And so I'm optimistic that it's possible to reach a consensus like that. I do agree that the World Trade Organization is presently constituted, and the free trade agreements that we presently have a lot of social externalities that need to be addressed. And it's the failure to address those social externalities, of course, that led to the rise of Donald Trump in the first place.
Great. We have a question here about Russia, especially pending indictments of Russian companies and individuals, I presume around election interference and interference in our social media. Is anything going to change there? Anybody want to take a stab at?
So one thing is, I think that, the Biden administration is definitely not going to want to be or be perceived as interfering in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. So we will have a new attorney general, and obviously in most places, probably new US attorneys as well, but cases that are underway will continue. I mean, the indictments of individual Russians aren't really going anywhere, just like the indictments of individual Chinese hackers, because we don't have custody of those individuals and aren't likely to get custody. Civil suits against Russian state entities for hacking and misinformation aren't going anywhere because of sovereign immunity, although there's a bill in Congress that would take that away. And then there aren't currently criminal prosecutions relating to Russian state entities that I'm aware of, although of course there is the Internet Research Agency indictment, which was effectively, right, an agent of Russia. Although again, even if a criminal prosecution goes forward, and even if there's enough proof to sustain criminal charges, it's hard to see how we would enforce any kind of penalty. So I think those indictments are important. I actually have a short article, if you're interested, whoever asked the question, called Attribution by Indictment, that you can find really easily on the internet. So I don't see a change. And I think that actually was a strategy that predated the Trump administration, although it may be more symbolic than practical.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. So taking into account that we have time for 2 short answers. One is a question of, is it possible, what are the prospects for holding the major players liable for family separation? And I guess that's to Professor Musallo. And then the last one, I'll put it out there as well, because this I think is for all of us. Given that there's a possibility of a Republican Senate, given remaining support for Trump, how realistic is the possibility of any of the changes that we've talked about happening quickly, or is it something that's going to have to be worked out over many years? So I want to end there, but I'd ask Professor Musallo if you have any idea if there are efforts to think about accountability for the family separations.
Yeah, so two very quick things about that. There is litigation ongoing, and I apologize that I don't know the details of that litigation, but on behalf of the families. And the second thing is that there's an effort, I mentioned that the Biden administration has committed to this task force to reunite families, but there's an effort to go further than that and to give the family members some legal status in the US. So to try to make whole for the extreme trauma and damage inflicted by the separation.
Okay, so on the last question, so what can be done quickly? What is going to take a long time? And I suppose part of that is what can be done by executive order and what is going to need legislation is part of the answer to that. But if my colleagues have crystal balls that they want to peer into for a second.
I would just say one quick thing, Naomi, and that is that historically, we've been in this place before. After World War I, we had an isolationist Republican Congress in opposition to our President Wilson that stopped the adoption of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. And it has historically been the case that one party or the other party plays isolationist at different points in time. But it's also been true since at least the Second World War that there has been some consensus formed of at least part of the Republican Party and part of the Democratic Party that favors some role internationally that is representative of our values. And I would expect that will continue.
Anyone else?
Maybe just to play directly off of that. Yeah, just to be very clear, even though I'm the gloom and doom panelist here talking about the 70 million Trump votes, I mean, Trump underperformed Republicans in a number of races, Maine, of course, very notably, I'm sure others as well. And there were, as everyone well knows, dozens, if not more, of former very high-ranking national security officials in both Democratic and Republican administrations who both before Trump was elected president and now have come out indicating that we need a return to integrity, to reliability, all these kinds of things. So although this foreign policy consensus is sometimes derided as the blob and certainly needs some reconsideration, particularly insofar as it has tended to overlook issues of domestic inequality, systemic racism, and so forth, that we really need to prioritize. I do agree with Joel that notwithstanding the rise of Trumpism and its continued, if not vibrancy, then at least presence, there certainly is room there for, if not a bipartisan consensus with the existing Republican Party, perhaps some sort of new party or coalition to emerge.
Professor Takash, Salo, last words?
Yes, I was going to address Anna's question. In recent years, the Congress has been rather dysfunctional, has been underperforming, and the executive branch has been accruing more and more power in dictating national and international affairs with respect to the environment. There are literally hundreds of executive branch actions that have been taken under President Trump that undermine environmental protection. There are certainly things that President-elect Biden can do on the first day. There are other things that are going to take several years to undo. As somebody asked in the chat, is there anything that can be done domestically to ensure stability in our foreign policy 4 or 8 years down the line? We are going to have a pendulum going back and forth that tries to undo the 4 years in the next 4 years. One final thing I'd like to say is that the power of the executive branch at a time when we might want to be undoing some of the environmentally destructive policies of the Trump administration might itself be undermined by Supreme Court that is likely to be increasingly hostile to executive branch unilateral actions. So at a time we want to undo some of the environmental damage, it might be more difficult for the Biden administration to do that compared to recent past administrations.
And if I could jump in with something that maybe is not at its heart a legal statement, but I mean, I think that what has happened has really laid bare some of the defects in our system of government, which purports to be democratic and represent the will of the majority, but in so many ways does not. And whether we're talking about the Electoral College, and we could have, you know, how many presidents elected who lost the popular vote but won the presidency, or if we talk about, you know, representation in Congress, and how many people in the Senate, you know, the Republicans represent what number of the U.S. population compared to the Democratic Senate, you know, or, you know, District of Columbia not having representation. So I think that this, you know, the issue of values came up a number of times, and does this country, is it true to its values? And you know, I think that this might be aspirational on my part, but I think that the US would have a better likelihood of being true to its values if we actually didn't suppress the vote, and if we actually had a truer democracy. And if you explain to many people in other countries the Electoral College and how somebody could lose the presidency and win the popular vote, you know, they scratch their head. You're a democracy. How can this be? So I know that this is a little bit, you know, not like, I'm not speaking as a law professor per se, but as somebody, again, who's just looking broadly at what we've seen in the last 4 years and thinking about what kinds of reforms might be necessary for us to move to a place where we represent our values better.
And with that, I think that's a great place to stop. So I'm going to ask you to help me thank our panelists for a really interesting discussion. And if you didn't get to ask your question, I'm really sorry, but I'm sure you can send a note to anybody on the panel and they'll be happy to talk with you about it. And thank you all for coming.